I thought I was interviewing a scientist about his work, until he dropped a bombshell about a murder he committed in WWII. Part 1. The Interview Invitation. Back in the early 1980s, when I was a high school student, life felt like a series of seemingly mundane tasks, punctuated occasionally by assignments that, while initially daunting, promised to offer a glimpse into the world beyond the classroom. One such assignment came in the form of a project, to interview a real-life working scientist. The task was meant to inspire us, to connect our dry textbook knowledge with the real, pulsating world of scientific discovery. It sounded exciting, but also intimidating. Where does a high school student even begin to find a scientist willing to be interviewed? Fortunately for me, my father was a professor at our local university. He wasn't a scientist himself, but his academic connections ran deep, and he was more than happy to help me out. One evening over dinner, I mentioned the project to him. His eyes lit up, and he nodded thoughtfully, as if mentally flipping through a Rolodex of colleagues and acquaintances. "I know just the person," he said, setting his fork down. "There's an older gentleman who works in the radiation lab at the university. He's a bit of a recluse, but he's brilliant. I'm sure he'd be willing to talk to you." The words radiation lab immediately captured my imagination. Images of scientists in white lab coats surrounded by glowing vials of strange substances danced in my head. It felt almost like stepping into the world of science fiction. I eagerly agreed, and my father promised to make the necessary arrangements. A few days later, he handed me a slip of paper with a name and a set of directions scrawled on it. The name was Dr. Edwin Marsh. The directions were a bit vague, referencing various hallways, staircases, and a basement. "The lab is in a remote part of the building," my father explained, "so it might take you a little while to find it, but don't worry, just follow the directions and you'll be fine." The next day, armed with a notepad, a pen, and a mixture of curiosity and nervousness, I made my way to the university. The campus was familiar enough to me. I'd visited my father's office many times, but the science buildings were a different world altogether. They were older, with an air of quiet mystery about them. I followed the directions carefully, weaving through hallways and descending staircases that seemed to get darker and more isolated the deeper I went. The university was bustling with life on the upper floors, but as I ventured down into the basement, the noise faded away, replaced by an eerie silence. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I found myself standing in front of a door that looked more like the entrance to a janitor's closet than a high-tech lab. A small, barely legible sign on the door read, "Radiation Laboratory." I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it. I took a deep breath, raised my hand, and knocked. The door creaked open almost immediately, revealing a dimly lit room filled with machines and equipment that looked both fascinating and slightly menacing. The air smelled faintly of chemicals, and there was a low hum of machinery that seemed to reverberate through the floor. Standing in the doorway was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, with thinning white hair and thick glasses that magnified his eyes to an almost comical degree. He was dressed in a well-worn lab coat, and his expression was one of mild surprise, as if he hadn't been expecting anyone. "You must be Dr. Marsh," I said, trying to sound confident. He nodded slowly, studying me with a curious expression. "Yes, that's right. And you are?" "I'm here for the interview. My name is—" "Ah, yes, the professor's son." His face softened, and he stepped aside to let me in. Come in, come in. It's been a while since I've had a visitor." I stepped into the lab, my eyes darting around, trying to take in everything at once. The room was cluttered, with papers, books, and equipment scattered haphazardly on every available surface. In the corner, a small desk was piled high with notebooks and folders, and a single lamp cast a warm glow over the workspace. Dr. Marsh motioned for me to sit in a chair near the desk, which I did, clutching my notepad and pen tightly. He settled into his own chair, folding his hands in his lap and looking at me expectantly. "So," he said, his voice soft and a bit raspy, "what would you like to know?" Part 2. The Scientist's Life. As Dr. Marsh sat across from me, his demeanor softened into that of a man who, though isolated by his work, was eager to share his knowledge. I started with the questions I had prepared, standard queries about his work in radiation, the challenges of his research, and the scientific achievements he was most proud of. Dr. Marsh answered them all with a calm, measured voice, his explanations clear and precise. He spoke of the early days of his career, how he had been drawn to the field of radiation research due to its potential for both great good and great harm. He described the complex nature of the work, the meticulous care required to handle radioactive materials, and the ever-present need for safety and precision. As he spoke, I scribbled down notes as fast as I could, trying to capture every detail. But as the interview progressed, I began to notice a shift in Dr. Marsh's tone. He grew more animated, his hands gesturing as he spoke, and his eyes, magnified by his thick glasses, began to glisten with an intensity that made me sit up a little straighter. "It's not just the science that fascinates me," he said, leaning forward slightly. "It's the human element, the way people respond to the unknown, to danger, to the mysteries that science can uncover. There's a certain psychological aspect to it, you see?" I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure where he was going with this. My high school brain was trying to keep up with the sudden depth of the conversation. He paused as if debating something internally, and then continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You know, young man, there's something I've never talked about with anyone. Not in this context, at least. It's a story from my past, from long before I became a scientist." There was a gravity to his words that made me instinctively lean in, my curiosity piqued. I had no idea what to expect, but I could tell that this was important, that whatever he was about to share was something that had been weighing on him for a long time. "When I was a young man," he began, his voice barely audible, "I served in the Navy during the Second World War. I was just a kid, really, barely out of my teens, when I was assigned to a small escort ship in the North Atlantic. Our job was to protect the convoys from German U-boats during the Battle of the Atlantic." His eyes took on a distant, haunted look, as if he were no longer in the dimly lit lab, but back on that ship, in the freezing, stormy waters of the Atlantic. "It was a terrifying time," he continued. "The storms were relentless, the cold was bone-chilling, and the threat of torpedoes was constant. Every day, every night we were on edge, knowing that at any moment we could be sent to the bottom of the ocean. The fear, it does things to a man." I could feel the tension in the room thickening, the air growing heavier with each word he spoke. I was no longer taking notes. My pen had frozen in mid-sentence, my attention completely captured by the intensity of Dr. Marsh's story. "There was this one night," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "The weather was brutal, the sea was a raging beast, and visibility was almost zero. I was on watch alone, staring out into the blackness when one of my crewmates, my friend, came to see me. He wasn't supposed to be there, and I could tell he was upset about something. We had a disagreement, something trivial in hindsight, but out there in that hell, everything felt magnified." Dr. Marsh paused, his hands trembling slightly as he relived the moment. "We argued," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He shoved me, I shoved him back, and then he slipped. He hit his head on a bulkhead and collapsed. I knelt beside him, calling his name, but he didn't respond. He wasn't breathing. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the horror of what he was describing sinking in. Dr. Marsh's face was pale, his expression a mix of sorrow and guilt. "I panicked," he said, tears welling up in his eyes. "I didn't know what to do. I was afraid of what would happen to me if anyone found out, so I did something unforgivable. I dragged him to the edge of the ship and pushed him overboard." He buried his face in his hands, his voice breaking as he continued. "The waves swallowed him up, and by morning he was just another sailor lost at sea, presumed to have fallen overboard during the storm. But I knew the truth. I had killed him." There was a long silence as Dr. Marsh wept quietly, his confession hanging in the air like a dark cloud. I sat there, stunned, unable to process what I had just heard. This wasn't the kind of story I had expected when I walked into that lab. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Marsh wiped his eyes and looked at me, his face etched with regret. "I've carried that burden with me my entire life," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I became a scientist, dedicated my life to understanding the mysteries of the universe, but nothing could ever erase what I did. It haunts me every day." Part 3. The Weight of Truth. The weight of Dr. Marsh's confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I sat frozen in my chair, my mind reeling from the gravity of what I had just heard. The interview had taken a turn I could never have anticipated, and I was left feeling unmoored, lost in a sea of emotions that I didn't know how to process. Dr. Marsh, for his part, seemed to shrink into himself, the years of solitude and guilt etched into the lines of his face. The confident, knowledgeable scientist I had met earlier had been replaced by a broken man, one who had been carrying the unbearable weight of his past for far too long. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to burden you with this. It's just, after all these years, I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. I needed to tell someone, and you were here. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? I was just a high school student, completely out of my depth, trying to grapple with the enormity of what I had just been told. The idea that someone could live with such a dark secret for so many years was both terrifying and heartbreaking. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to find my voice. "Thank you for trusting me with this," I said, the words sounding hollow and inadequate. I don't know what to say." Dr. Marsh nodded, a sad, knowing smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "There's nothing you can say, really. I've made my peace with it, as much as one can. But it doesn't change what happened. It doesn't bring him back." We sat in silence for a few moments longer, the hum of the machines in the lab the only sound breaking the stillness. I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, a heavy, inescapable truth that would linger long after I left that basement. Eventually, Dr. Marsh cleared his throat and straightened up in his chair, as if trying to regain some semblance of composure. "I think that's enough for today," he said, his voice still tinged with sorrow. "You've got what you came for, and, well, I've said more than I intended." I nodded, still too stunned to form a coherent response. I gathered my things, slipping my notepad into my bag with trembling hands. As I stood up to leave, Dr. Marsh reached out and placed a hand on my arm, stopping me in my tracks. "One more thing," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Whatever you do with your life, remember this. The choices we make, even in moments of fear and desperation, can have consequences that last a lifetime. Don't ever forget that." I nodded again, the weight of his words sinking deep into my soul. "I won't forget," I promised, my voice barely a whisper. With that, I turned and made my way to the door, the reality of what had just transpired still sinking in. As I stepped out of the lab and into the dimly lit hallway, the air felt heavier, the shadows darker. I navigated my way through the labyrinthine basement, my thoughts swirling with a mix of emotions I couldn't even begin to untangle. When I finally emerged into the sunlight, the world felt different. The brightness of the day seemed almost offensive after the darkness of the lab and the even darker story I had just heard. I stood there for a moment, letting the warmth of the sun wash over me, trying to shake off the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I wandered the campus for a while, my mind racing as I replayed the interview over and over in my head. How could someone live with such a secret for so long? And why had he chosen to share it with me, a stranger? A kid who had come to ask about his work and instead walked away with a confession of murder. By the time I finally made it home, it was late afternoon. My father was in his study grading papers, and he looked up when I walked in. "How did it go?" he asked, his tone light and casual. I hesitated, not sure how much to reveal. "It was intense," I said, which was the understatement of the century. He frowned slightly, picking up on my tone. "Intense? How so?" I struggled to find the right words. Dr. Marsh, he shared some things about his past, things that weren't really about science." My father's expression shifted to one of concern. "What kind of things?" I couldn't bring myself to tell him the whole truth. The burden felt too heavy, too personal. Just stuff from when he was in the Navy. It was kind of dark. My father studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. Sometimes people need to talk about things they've kept inside for too long. It sounds like that might have been the case with Dr. Marsh. Yeah, I said softly, my mind still reeling. My father didn't press the issue, for which I was grateful. Instead, he gave me a reassuring smile. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. I nodded, managing a small smile in return. Thanks, Dad. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I tried to focus on my homework, but my mind kept drifting back to Dr. Marsh and his story. I couldn't shake the image of him, alone in that lab, haunted by the ghosts of his past. I wondered if he felt any relief after telling me, or if it had only dredged up old wounds that had never fully healed. That night, as I lay in bed, sleep eluded me. The weight of the day pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I replayed the interview in my mind, trying to make sense of it all, but there were no easy answers. The truth was messy, complicated, and deeply unsettling. In the days that followed, I wrote up my interview for the project, carefully editing out the more personal aspects of Dr. Marsh's story. I focused on his scientific work, the challenges and rewards of his research, and the impact it had on the field of radiation studies. But the real story, the one that had left an indelible mark on me, remained locked away in my memory, too heavy to share with anyone else. Looking back, that interview was a turning point for me. It taught me that life is full of unexpected twists, that the people we meet often carry burdens we can't even begin to imagine, and that the truth, while powerful, is not always easy to bear. Dr. Marsh's confession left a permanent imprint on my soul, a reminder of the complexities of the human experience and the weight of the choices we make. And though I never saw him again, his words stayed with me, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of living with integrity and compassion. Years later, as I pursued my own career, I often thought of Dr. Marsh and the secret he had shared with me. It became a touchstone for me, a reminder to approach life with humility, to recognize that everyone carries their own burdens, and to strive to make choices that I could live with, no matter the circumstances. In the end, the interview that was supposed to be about science became a lesson in humanity, in the deep, often painful complexities that lie beneath the surface of our lives. And though I never told anyone the full story, it shaped me in ways I could never have anticipated, guiding me through the challenges and uncertainties of life with a deeper understanding of the human condition.